Welcome to Backup Exec 2012, Restoring Data. If you're following along in the book, we're in Lesson 6. In this lesson, we'll talk about restored job basics, how to set up a restored job. There are guided methods to help you do your restores, how to run a restored job, how to restore individual items using GRT, and then we'll take an overview of simplified disaster recovery and my server restore workflow when I do that recovery. We have an entire lesson on simplified disaster recovery that follows. For restored job basics, a restored job is reading the catalogs from which you can restore anything that we have backed up, that Backup Exec has backed up. You can restore things from previous versions of Backup Exec. You can restore the entire machine, single files, granular files, system settings, whatever you need to bring back, provided you had backed it up. So there are several types of restores available for you. You can do the restore based on what kind of data you backed up, meaning files and folders, or you can do the restore based on where you backed it up, meaning disk or tape, and you can browse the location where the backup was written and choose things to restore from that location. There are several guided methods to help you with your restores. You can do a search through the catalogs to choose what you wish to restore. This is usually used for user data restores where they need you to restore something I was working on yesterday, but I don't really know the name of it. So you can do searches in the catalogs with wildcards to find what you're looking for. You can do restores based on media, based on location that was backed up. So I can say simply restore something from this server, and you can do simplified disaster recovery. That's a full bare metal recovery. So by default, restores will always send the data back to the same location from which it was backed up. You can specifically tell it to redirect, and it depends on what you're redirecting, how you redirect it. We'll talk about that more in the individual data type lessons, such as SQL and Exchange. You can generally start restores immediately. From a practical standpoint, I have found it also makes sense to start the restore job but put it on hold if you're waiting for tapes to come back from a courier. I can also specify the network card, NIC, through which to run the restore, so I'm routing the restore traffic through the NIC that I chose, so I send it through the LAN or the SAN as is appropriate. To do searches, we're going to go to the Backup and Restore tab, and in the Restore section, click the Search button in the ribbon. It will bring up the wizard that will allow you to do searches. And when you get to the search screen, in the file or folder name field, that supports the wildcards, the DOS wildcards of either an asterisk or a question mark. You can just tell it to restore things based on when it was created, how big the file is, where did it live when you backed it up. So you have to know where it came from. But I can also do restores based on documents. So I can just give it the document name. In this case, in the bottom screen, that's the Exchange example, but you could also restore documents from SharePoint or user data directories. At this point, Backup Exec is not looking at the location where the data is written. When you're doing searches, you're searching the catalogs. So once I have completed my search and I tell Backup Exec that I'm ready to do the restore, only then will it go out and mount the media from which to do the restore, be that hard drive space or removable media. I can also do restores, tell it to do complete restores. I can restore SQL Server databases. For simplified disaster recovery, I can set the defaults for how I want it to behave. So if I go to Configuration Settings, Backup Exec Settings, and look at Simplified Disaster Recovery, you can set the path for where your recovery data lives. This is a disaster recovery file that every time you run a backup that is simplified disaster recovery enabled, will write this file into this location. This file should also be written into another location, preferably off-site, but at least another server. This is essentially the catalog for this simplified disaster recovery backup. So it will create a file. The default path you see here is under data, SDR data, SDR being simplified disaster recovery. You really, best practice here would be to populate the alternate path, preferably to an FTP site or a location separate from where you're saving the original file. The whole point of this is to be able to recover your Backup Exec server. If you save this file locally, that makes it very difficult. To run a restore job, we're going to go to the Backup and Restore tab, click the Restore button in the ribbon and tell it what type of restore we're going to run. In this case, it'll be files or folders. So we select File and Folder Backups. It will come to a screen that allows you to select what you want to restore. And this should look very familiar to those of you who came from older versions of Backup Exec. This is essentially the same restore screen. It will show you a date and timestamp for all the backups that you have available. You can drill down into each backup and select individual items from that backup that you choose to restore. The next screen will ask you, where do you want the restore data to go? The default is that it will always restore to the location from which it was backed up. If you choose to redirect it, you can choose the second radio button down, which says to a different location, and provide the location for which you want that restore to be written, to which you want that restore to be written. You can also choose different options for this. I can say to restore files that are corrupt. Getting something back is often better than nothing at all, so you can still restore them even if they're corrupt. By default, it will recreate the directory structure occasionally, and this is fairly rare now, but occasionally there have been issues with restoring a full directory structure if the path was greater than 254 characters. So if you had a very long file path, one of the things that you could do is uncheck this box, which would restore all the files into a shorter path. The recommendation now is simply to run the restore, see if it works with this mark so that it recreates the directory structure, and if you have problems, then to come back and troubleshoot at that point. Restore over existing files is relatively straightforward. Restore permissions is something that can be very useful, and many people don't realize that Backup Exec has this capability. The default is it restores the files with all of their Windows permissions. Sometimes what happens is the user will right-click on the file and take ownership, which changes the permissions, and the files are no longer inheriting the permissions from the directory structure the way they should. So when you do the restore, it appears that the file's restored, the restore was successful, but you go out and look in the directory and you don't see any files. So what's happened is you no longer have rights to access those files, so Windows is not showing it to you. So one of the things that I can do is the next radio button down, which is to restore the file without any permissions at all. You're restoring all the data for the file and everything about the file except its permissions. And when you redirect that into an NTFS share or folder, it will then inherit its permissions the way files should in Windows. So you're effectively wiping out the permissions that were incorrect to begin with. The third option on this section is to restore just the permissions but not the file itself. So if you knew when the user had changed the permissions, you could go to an older backup that had them correct and restore the permissions without affecting any of the data in the file. So it's very versatile here. And then you can also tell it to restore operating system features that have to do with disk storage data and disk quota. If you need to restore disk quota, I would highly encourage you to go out and read some of the knowledge base articles that have to do with disk quotas and clusters, clustered volumes. The very last one on this slide is about junction points. Microsoft will often call these parse points. A junction point or a parse point is where you have put in a marker on a volume that allows the data to cross to another location similar to a mapped drive without a drive letter. Backup Exec will always back up the fact that there is a junction point or a parse point there. On the restore side, though, what you're able to say is, do you want to restore those junction points or do you want to preserve existing? So a good example of this is, if I have a database and an application that does not want me to change the location of that database, it will break the application if I change the location of the database. But where the database is writing is filling up and I don't have enough space. What I can do is put in a junction point so that it's no longer writing to the D drive where it was, but now it's writing to a SAN device through that UNC path for the junction point that I put in. So the application thinks that it's still going to the original location. The junction point is allowing the data to go across to a SAN device. Backup Exec will always back up the fact that that junction point exists. In the backup, I must also tell it to follow the junction point and go get the data. So on the restore side, I have backed up this data from old hardware, and I now want to restore it to new hardware that has plenty of space. So on my restore, in my example, I would say preserve existing. So I'm going to back it up where it followed the junction point and get all the data. But on the restore, I'm going to redirect to this new location, and I don't need the junction point anymore. It has plenty of room. So I want to preserve existing, meaning there aren't any. So you can use this as you need to. If you're not sure whether you have junction points or parse points, it's probably because you don't. But you're certainly welcome to go read up on them. Other things that I can do as part of the restore job, I can run pre and post commands. I may need to stop or start services before or after the restore job runs, and I can also schedule restores so that they run at some point in the future. Probably the best example of this is to submit the job on hold, search the so you search the catalogs, find what you want to restore, submit the job on hold while you wait for a tape to return through a courier. And once the tape returns, you inventory it, you take the job off hold, and the restore will run. When you're finished with the wizard, it will give you a summary of what you're about to do, and it will show you the location to which the restore will run. When you're ready to restore system state is a very special restore. System state can contain Active Directory, and it can also contain the registry and WMI information. So this is hardware specific. To restore system state to a domain controller also means that you are restoring Active Directory, which may or may not be something you intend to do. So you have to understand the impact of what that means. By default, Active Directory is replicated out to other domain controllers or Exchange servers. If my Active Directory controller, my domain controller, goes down, it's really better for Active Directory not to restore system state. Bring the domain controller back up, but let Active Directory replicate back in. All right, so that's, if I have to though, if my whole data center went down, and I have to recover Active Directory. That's part of system state. What I will need to do is start the computer in safe mode, use Directory Services Restore mode to do the restore, and perform what's known as an authoritative restore of Active Directory, which means that this becomes the master copy, and if there are replicas, it's what gets replicated back out. I have a couple of different options with shadow copy components. Shadow copy components are where I have used Microsoft's VSS or Volume Shadow Copy service to protect either user data or third-party applications. You can set this up yourself. If you go to Windows Explorer and right-click on any volume and go to Properties, one of the tabs that you will see is Shadow Copy Components. Often this is used as a backup device. So I will enable Shadow Copy on my user data folders so that if a user were to delete a file or drop it in the wrong place and think they lost it, and they call me and say, I need you to restore, it's very easy for me to do that restore from Shadow Copy. Shadow copying also does versioning, so if they did a save instead of a save as, I can restore an older version. What we're talking about here is Backup Exec backed up that shadow copy area that is already a backup location, and we're talking about being able to restore it. Now, shadow copy can hold several things, one of them being WMI information, but there are Backup Exec specific components that are also contained in shadow copy, and that is information to do with data deduplication disk storage and Microsoft's distributed file system replication that are contained within that shadow copy. So you can restore those as well. If you can restore any individual item that was backed up using the granular recovery technology, the key to this is you had to back it up using GRT in the first place. So if you did that backup where you had GRT, the checkbox ticked, you can restore any piece that you see on this screen that's related to GRT-based backup. So you can restore individual items. If you had done your backup to tape, on the restore side, it will have to restore the entire database to a directory that you name, and then it can restore the individual items. So if you did your backups, GRT-based backups to tape, it has to stage the restore, and it's a two-stage restore coming back. You'll see your restore jobs running. If I go to jobs, you'll see them running. Be very cautious about canceling large restore jobs, especially if you had done a large system restore or a system state restore. You can cancel these jobs. They will take a moment to cancel. It has to finish the file that is being restored, and then it has to clear the job. So it may take it a moment, but it is possible if you were restoring an entire server or system state and you cancel that job, it is possible to leave that machine in an unstable state. So if you reboot it, it may blue screen. So be very cautious about canceling large restores. Simplified disaster recovery allows you to very quickly and easily restore entire servers. So this is where I would go to my restore screen, and I want to do the complete online restore. It will ask you what you wish to restore. In this case, we're going to restore the entire Microsoft Windows computer. And then what backup sets do you wish to restore? You'll notice a couple of things about this slide. One of them is that you've got two sections. I have components necessary for a complete restore and another section for application data. So it's asking you, do you want to do the full system restore here, which is going to be fairly fast, and maybe do the data restore after you get the system up and running, which is the most efficient way to do it. But you can restore all of it at the same time. If the application data was installed, the application, let's say that it's SQL, if I had installed SQL to the E drive, I would also need to restore the installation files for SQL, right, the binaries, the services.exe files, to the E drive before I could restore the data. So it depends on how you had installed the applications, whether you would need to restore that volume as part of this complete recovery. I can tell at what point in time I wish to recover to. It will show you a date and timestamp listing of all the backups that are available. By default, it will always show you the most current backup and assume that you want to restore the most current. So you could choose the drop-down menu and choose an older one if you wanted to. It will also let you do a system state restore. If you are restoring a domain controller, this would include Active Directory. System state also by default includes the registry. On the system state restore side, you can drill down and see all of the backups you have for system state by their date and timestamp. But unlike the backup side where you could only back up all of system state, on the restore side, you can restore individual components of system state. So I could restore just the registry or just the system files. So be very cautious here on what you choose to recover. If you're changing hardware, restoring WMI can cause it to have problems on when you reboot the machine. So we have talked about the basic functionality of restore jobs, that there are several guided methods to help you choose what to restore. We've talked about how to run a restore job, and we've talked about restoring GRT-based items and system state items. For specifics on restoring applications, please look at those application lessons such as Exchange and SharePoint and SQL.